Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Internationally podcast. Before we start, let me talk a little bit about the podcast. So, the Internationally podcast is going to be a space where different international students, prospective ones, as well as current international students, could get a glimpse of the life of international students in the US or abroad. And this week, I am joined by my very, very dear friend, Beti. Welcome to the show, Beti.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So let me talk a little bit about your background and then we'll delve into the conversation.
Sounds good.
So, yeah, okay. So Beti is from Ethiopia. She is currently a senior studying chemistry at Smith College. She is involved in community health on campus and also in Sierra Leone. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, I think that summarizes me. I don't have too many facts.
All right. So the title of this episode is Dealing with Loss and Wellness.
Yeah.
So, as a starting question, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear the word loss?
That's a really good question. I think, especially now, actually, it's very broad. Like this year, especially, so many people have had to deal with loss, whether that's someone that's close to you or even just the loss of the experiences and the year we all had planned that we didn't get to have. That's a huge loss too. So I guess loss in a way is feeling like you're missing something or your expectations for something or someone were not met, and that can be hard to deal with, and that's why we're talking about it.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful way of describing what loss is. I'm like, for me, when I hear the word loss, I immediately associate it with losing a family member or someone close to me. But you brought up an interesting point of losing experiences and the loss of things as well. It's not necessarily people. As an international student, while you were in college, what were some of the things that you had to deal with regarding loss?
Yeah. So I think, well, since you took it to actually losing family members, and I think that is the traditional meaning that everyone associates with loss. Before I came to college, I had never really experienced losing someone in that sense. I had lost family members, but never someone who was close to me. And then I guess the end of my sophomore year, our family lost our grandmother. I guess in the English sense, not really my grandmother, my aunt's mother, but you know how in Ethiopian families, everyone's closer. So she was kind of like a grandmother figure, and we lost her to cancer. And a year after that, my father passed away. So definitely, I think those are more of the traditional meanings people think of when they think of loss. And I'd love to hear your experiences with loss too.
Yeah. So for me personally, the first time I ever had to deal with losing a family member was when I was 13 and when my cousin passed away. And so I think it's been 10 years now, but I'm still dealing with it.
Right.
I feel like a lot of times because it's considered taboo, or I don't know if it's only Ethiopians who deal with it, but we don't really talk about loss or how to deal with it. So that was one of the things that I really struggled with. And especially when I went to college, my first year, I used to think about him a lot because he also went to college. And so he didn't finish before, he passed away. And so I used to think a lot about him. I was like, he was also by himself, he was alone, and all of those things. Especially when you don't have someone to talk to about it, it's really difficult. And so that was my experience, but I don't really know what helped me to get through it. But I remember while in college, I always had this constant fear of getting that phone call and someone telling me, someone passed away. But then thankfully, in my immediate family members, like I didn't lose anybody during college, but it was always a constant fear that I had. Do you relate to that?
Yeah, I'm actually so glad you brought that up, because I don't personally relate to that, but I know a lot of people do. And that's the challenge. Well, dealing with loss for anybody is really challenging, but as an international student, there's always this added layer of, the distance of being so far away from home. And yeah, I think that's what we were talking about, is just this feel of not having control, and not, if something happens, what's going to happen? I'm not going to be there. So yeah, definitely that fear, I think, exists for lots of international students.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's like me personally, but I want people to tell me when like something bad happens. So my parents, trying to like protect me or whatever. So when I used to go for winter break, like a distant aunt or an uncle passes away, they would tell me when I went there. So it would be like months after the person has passed, and they'd be like, yeah, so and so has passed, and I'll get really angry. I was just like, why don't you just tell me over the phone? But their reasoning is because you're alone, you have school, we don't want you to worry or like feel sad by yourself. But then I just get angry, like you should have told me, like that's my decision to make.
Right.
So do you feel that kind of feeling?
I absolutely understand where you're coming from, but I also understand where your parents are coming from, because both, you brought up why it was so hard for you to deal with loss as a 13-year-old, and versus now maybe it would or wouldn't be the same thing. And I think for me, actually, what helped a lot for me, during the grieving period, was having that sense of family. So both times when I heard the news, it was, well, the first time it was through a phone call, but the second time when my father passed away, my aunt and uncle, who live about 3 hours away, drove all the way to my college and, told me the news, but then they drove me back to their home, and I got to stay with them for about a few days. I mean, I had to go to class and I didn't want to miss school, but it was definitely being surrounded by people. And I think that's something you don't realize is so important and so valuable until you have it or until you lose it, right? And I think definitely I do understand what your parents are saying, that when you're alone, it's also a cultural thing. In the US, there's a lot of individualistic notions about dealing with any kind of, suffering or loss or mental health. But in our culture, that's very much a communal thing. We deal with loss, we grieve collectively, we grieve in families. If I had been home, there would have been like 50 people that visited me to say their condolences, and they did. Like when I was at my aunt's house, I got phone calls like all day, every single day. And that's partly, I think, what made it so easy to move on, was just the reminder that, wow, look at all these people that love and care about me.
Yeah. And that's a very important thing that you said, because different societies and different cultures have a different way of dealing with losing someone, I was actually listening to the radio, I think a couple of weeks ago, and someone was saying, like, in Nigeria, I don't remember like the specific tribe, but if someone passes away and they are, I think, below the age of 30 or something, like they're young, that's when people grieve and like they make such a big deal out of it. But if they lose someone who's like of age, as in like, they've lived a lot, like 50, 60, 70 years, then they don't even have like a funeral, because they're like, they have lived their life. So we're supposed to grieve those who didn't get a chance to live their lives. And so I thought that was like so interesting.
That is very interesting.
Yeah, because as you said, it's mostly cultural. But what were some of the things that maybe you liked or disliked about the Ethiopian culture of dealing with loss?
Yeah, sure. And before I get to that, I just want to say, like, to anyone listening, to make this practical, I do think it's important to identify what is your way of dealing with loss. What's something that helps you, whether that's cultural or just individual. And for me, for us, it's definitely this community thing. So if you don't have family around you the way I did, you can still reach out and build community in your campus and your friends. At our college, they have grieving or like a support group. I think they even have one for like specifically for people who lost parents. But those resources do exist, and I think that no one has to go through it alone. So
That's a
yeah, I
good point.
agree with you
Thank you.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. And so specifically about how Ethiopians deal with loss, um, we're definitely, I think, more emphatic and emotional. You know, we like to express grief. And there's also this idea that if you don't, it's almost disrespectful, you know? You grieve
Yeah.
kind of to show that,
Yeah.
to show
I know.
respect for that person's life and their family. And that I definitely, you know, identify with that because that's my culture. But
Yeah.
personally, I didn't feel the need to grieve for so long, you know, like I heard the news, like maybe cried about it for a day, but then I was good. Like I had a lot of love and support, and I was also, again, this is also just differences in how everyone deals with grief. So by no means does everyone have the same timeline, but for me and, you know, my idea of death and stuff, it was pretty short. And so there was definitely people who thought that was confusing to them, like, you know, that was the person who was your best friend, that was your father, you know, you should be grieving for longer, you should be wearing black, for example.
Yeah. So
And
in Ethiopian culture, like everybody wears black for a year,
yes,
right?
yeah, I
Or is
think
it? Yeah.
I'm not sure how long they do it for, but definitely, I mean, my mom, I think, was wearing black even when I went to visit her like 6 months later, but not 6 months, like 3 months later. And yeah, that wasn't really how I was going to deal with it. And I knew that. And, you know, it's also just honoring the person too. Like my father would have laughed at me if I did that, because he wouldn't
Yeah.
even he would hate the idea of people like being upset and grieving over him. Like he was a very happy man. He loved everyone to celebrate and be happy. And that was my way of honoring him, was to just, you know, keep living my life as joyfully as I could. And so I think definitely that was a bit of a cultural and personal clash, but yeah, you deal with those too.
Yeah. And I'm so glad that you shared that, Beti, because as you mentioned, like that's not the way like most people deal with grief in Ethiopia. Um,
Mm-hmm.
which is why I want to ask you like your personal experience of like how did you deal with loss? Like
Mm,
what were the things that happened?
yeah. You know, it's so interesting. I actually think what you're asking is a much deeper question than it seems, because when people die, that's the first time a lot of us really face death, even the idea of death. So we're not just mourning the loss of someone, we're mourning our idea of our life being like immortal. And like, you know, we don't have to, no one wants to think about death. We want to just think, you know, that's something that's going to happen in the future. I don't really have to worry about it now. But the truth is, it could be anyone. And I think part of the reason why, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to assume things
No,
about you, but
it's okay.
part of the reason why you found it difficult was that your cousin was in college, right? Like he
Yep.
was the age you were when you went to college. That's pretty powerful. That kind of should be a reminder to you that, you know, it doesn't actually matter your age. It could be something you deal with too. So I think for me, it definitely does. Every time someone passes away, no matter how close I am to them, it does affect you, right? And for me, one of the things it does is remind me that life isn't forever, you know, that we have a limited amount of time here. And there's actually, this is why I warned you that I was going to take this deep, but
It's
there's
okay,
actually
please.
a whole philosophy called Stoicism. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but they basically believe that we do have to think about death in order to live fulfilling lives. And to them it's also just realism, you know, you're going to die, so why are you avoiding it? Why don't you address it and actually use it to make your life meaningful? And so I also kind of believe in that, and I do think about that pretty consistently, like reflect about it daily. You know, was the person I am today the person I would want to leave people with? You know, if something were to happen to me, am I satisfied with how I'm living my life? And if because I do reflect on those questions more,
Yeah.
when someone dies, it's not I'm not really being faced with that death part. I'm being faced more with just, you know, having a personal connection with them and grieving that. And because I'm a Christian, that part is not that hard to deal with, because I remember that they're in heaven, they're in a better place, and obviously we're gonna meet again, hopefully.
Aw, that is
So,
very, very nice. Yeah.
so yeah,
Okay.
that's how I deal with it.
Thank you for sharing that. And I have to say, like, Beti, you're one of the strongest peoples that I know. The way, I don't know, because when I read your post, I cried, and
Mm.
I was just like, she's so strong. Um, and so, yeah, so thank you for sharing that. For
Thank
me
you for
personally,
saying
I
that.
think the way, yeah, of course, the way I dealt with loss was, at first I was confused. I was like,
Mm.
how is this even possible? So I think, I don't know, like, people say there are like stages of grief. Like, first it's
Mm.
denial, and then there's
Mm-hmm.
anger, and then there's something, and then there's acceptance. Did you hear about that?
I have heard of it.
Yeah. So I think I went through that process, but
Okay.
I'm still working on the acceptance part. I know it's crazy. It's been 10 years, but
Mm.
even like
No.
talking about it now, it's like taking so much from me. But I feel like it's a conversation that we need to have, because a lot of times, like, people go through this silently. And so, especially
Mm.
in college, where you lose someone and then you have nobody to talk to. So that could be like a very difficult position to be in. And so I want
Mm.
to ask you, like, what were some of the resources you used, or some of the things that helped you cope with the
Mm.
loss?
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing also just the fact that you still feel like you are on the stages of grieving. And I think that's really important to tell people too, that that's what I was trying to get at, that we're all different. There is no timeline for grief. I mean, those stages, they might apply to everyone, they might not apply to you, and you might feel like you're stuck at a stage forever. And I think having those expectations can be even harder than dealing with the loss itself, because then you're mourning not just the loss, but you're mourning you
Yeah.
not being able to get through it the way you wanted to. So, but yeah, you're right that talking about it definitely is the only way to confront it. And that's something I struggled with too, I think, on some level, because when my father passed away, he was very influential in my life, and I talk about him all the time. But when he passed away, I felt like I couldn't talk about him anymore, because I didn't want people to be sad. When I usually bring him up in conversation, it's to inspire someone, it's to tell them, this reminds me of something my dad did. And I noticed when I do that now, it's more just, oh,
Yeah,
her
like
father
people's
passed away,
reactions.
yeah. And yeah, I didn't like that, so I stopped talking about him. And then, so fast forward, when I went home for like a week after the semester was over, I got to talk about him all the time, because I was with my mom and my sister, and we were just like reminiscing and remembering him and the person he was. And that was super therapeutic. That was healing, because it was like I could finally just release and like remember him, and it didn't have to be sad or weird.
Yeah.
So I think that is also really helpful, if you can get to a place or even be around people where you can speak without feeling like you need to be filtered, or that you need to, like you said, that you need to be at a certain stage of grief. Like, people that will accept you whatever stage you're at, I guess. And if you're scared that no one will, then that might mean scheduling like a counselor appointment or something too.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, thank you for sharing that as well. So, like, what do you think are some of the things that people could personally do to prepare for it?
Hmm.
So, do you think you could
Mm.
prepare for
Yes.
loss?
I absolutely do, and I think we should all be preparing. So I hinted at that, when I was talking about dealing with death. You shouldn't have to wait for someone to die for you to realize you could die. You could lose everything any moment.
That's
I
correct. Yeah.
think that's a truth that we all have to confront. And if you don't, it's going to show up in, when you do have to deal with some kind of suffering, some kind of thing that makes you question it. And we're going to talk more about like wellness and actually
Yeah.
building up healthy practices. But I guess specifically to loss, I would say building a support system around you that kind of reminds you of who you are, who your identity is. Because another part of this cultural thing is that in the US, people's identities are formed within them, and then they kind of find affirmations for them, or else, this is controversial, but this is
Yeah,
part
it's
of
okay.
my understanding. And then in our culture and in lots of other cultures, our identity is actually formed by our families, by the people around us. And that's why you find so many international students or daughters, sons of immigrants who live for their parents. They're going to school to please their parents. They're studying to please their parents. And then what do you do when your parents pass away? It's like, well, now you have to figure out who you are and where you fit into this world.
Yep.
So yeah, don't wait to lose your parents to start living for yourself. Try to make that balance happen. And I think reflecting on that regularly will help you, no matter if you deal with loss or not. It'll just help you be a stronger person.
Yeah, totally. I agree with what you said. For me personally, I think because I didn't feel comfortable, I don't even know if comfortable is the right word, but I didn't feel, because as you said, whenever I brought the subject up, I would see the reaction of those around me. And so because I don't want to stir up the old wounds that we all have, I just completely avoided talking about it. But like actually recently I had a conversation about it with my dad, and he was able to like tell me all like what happened and everything. Like, so part of my grieving process was also like not knowing what happened. And so I feel like even, and then he told me, he's like, you should have asked before. And so I didn't know I could ask, you see. So that was like, wow. Oh my God, like all this time, yeah, all this time I was like, I couldn't talk about this. But then when I finally had it actually even wasn't like, the topic was so different, but then I kind of like inserted my question into it. So I was able to get the answers that I wanted, and that was like a shock for me. So it also was a lesson for me, where you might think that people might not want to discuss the topic, but you should at least ask, I feel like, if you still have unanswered questions. But another thing that really helped me was journaling. So because that whole time, like, I didn't have anybody to talk to, I used to write a lot. So I used to write letters, not to him, but just to myself as well. So just like writing down what I was feeling. There will be like instances, and you never know like when you would remember that person, because it's not like every single day you actively remember them, but like something you watch or like something you hear, like those things, like I think they are triggers to the memories that you have of that person. And so whenever that used to happen, I used to write down things, and I think that significantly helped me. Yeah. Did you journal?
That's amazing. I do journal, and I think journaling is an amazing way to get in touch with your emotions, because like you said, those triggers will come up. Someone you might just hear like a random person died that you don't even know, and that could still stir up those emotions within you that you didn't even know were there. And so how do you know they're there? Well, you confront them. Like when you feel a certain way about something, instead of running from it, you face it. And I want to say, I know this is a lot harder to do than we're talking about it. And for both of us, I think it has taken like a lot of time to get to where we are now. And I think, that's also worth acknowledging. But you do grow. I really do believe that you do grow, and you need to stop expecting that after a loss or a hard experience, you're gonna just go back to the person you are. That shouldn't even be the goal. The goal should be to grow from it, to actually become this whole new person who's been changed by their experience, who's learned from it and can use it to shape their life. And journaling is a great way to do that. Reflecting with people, and like you said, even opening up to someone. It could be so scary at first because you don't know what they're gonna say, but sometimes people will surprise you. They're so understanding, they're so compassionate. And even if they're not, you'll be okay. I think that's also important. It's like, you don't know how strong you are until you have no other choice but to be strong.
Wow, that should be a quote. I'm gonna make that into a quote.
It actually is a quote.
Oh, okay.
Just FYI, I'm not gonna take credit for it. It was Bob Marley who said that.
Really? Wow.
Yeah,
that is so
he
powerful.
did.
Wait, can you say it again?
Yeah, so I think it was, you don't know how strong you are until you have no other choice but to be strong.
Wow, that is very powerful. And I think like for someone who's going through the process right now, or who's just thinking about it, I think the stories that we've shared and the tips that you have shared, hopefully would help somebody, you know,
Yeah.
as
And I
an,
think for anyone
yeah,
that's even gotten through this year, it's like they probably
mm,
relate to that quote so much, because it's like, if you told me I had to get through a pandemic a year ago, it might
yeah,
have been like, I don't know, I'm not ready, you know?
exactly,
But then you get through it and you're okay.
yeah, um, yeah, exactly. And now let's transition into the topic of wellness.